Imagine, imagine stepping off a creaky wooden ship in 1733, right? And you're arriving in this sweltering, bug-infested coastal swamp.
Oh, miserable conditions. Just completely miserable.
Right, and the governing authority, they hand you a strict 50-acre plot of land, and they tell you very clearly that you can never, under any circumstances, buy your neighbor's property to expand your own farm.
You're permanently capped. That's it.
Exactly. And on top of that, they inform you that using enslaved labor is strictly prohibited by law. You're expected to carve out this self-sufficient, fiercely egalitarian, agrarian utopia out of the wilderness.
Which sounds lovely on paper, sure.
Yeah, but you're doing all of this while sitting geographically right next door to the wealthiest, most ruthlessly stratified plantation society on the face of the earth.
South Carolina.
South Carolina. You are basically being asked to build this modest, perfectly balanced little neighborhood right next door to a sprawling, violently guarded billionaire's estate.
I mean, it is a blueprint for catastrophic social tension. It really is.
Yep.
Because you're describing an environment where this idealized vision of a philanthropic founder is put on a direct high-speed collision course with the most intense economic and geopolitical pressures imaginable.
It really is wild.
The blueprint dictates one reality, right? But the actual environment, the swamp, the neighbors, they demand something entirely different.
And that tension, that exact collision, is the core of our deep dive today. We are taking a really comprehensive historical encyclopedia entry that covers the long history of the state of Georgia, and we're unpacking two of the most massive fundamental transitions in American colonial history.
Two really mind-blowing shifts.
Yeah. First, we're examining the geopolitical mechanics of how this region was violently flipped from a Spanish-influenced missionary territory into a British stronghold.
Right.
And second, we are tracing how the founder, James Oglethorpe, and his incredibly radical blueprint for an egalitarian society were just utterly consumed by the machinery of the Southern plantation economy.
Which is a transition that really requires us and you as the listener to rethink how societies actually develop.
Yeah, how so?
Well, we often fall into this trap, right, of viewing history as this inevitable straight-line march. Like, you assume things happen simply because they were always destined to happen that way.
It's just a foregone conclusion.
Exactly. But the founding of this specific territory is this fascinating masterclass in engineered social planning just collapsing under its own weight.
Totally.
It demonstrates the sheer velocity at which lofty ideals just evaporate when they're squeezed by military threats, environmental hostility, and just the overwhelming allure of commodity wealth.
Okay, let's unpack this by winding the clock way back.
Yeah.
Well before the British even conceptualized this egalitarian utopia.
Well, way back.
Because the prevailing myth, the one we all kind of absorb, is that English colonists just sailed up to a pristine, totally empty coastline, planted a flag, and just started from scratch.
The empty continent.
Right. Exactly. But the sources paint a picture of a heavily contested frontier that had actually been occupied by Europeans for over a century before the British even showed up.
Yeah, that pristine wilderness narrative is one of the most persistent historical blind spots we have.
It's everywhere.
We really need to look at the late 16th century here. Long before the British established any kind of foothold, the Spanish had built a modest but strategically vital presence in this exact region.
In Georgia.
Right. They operated a whole network of Catholic missions in these coastal provinces that they called Guale and Mocama.
Gual and Mocama. Okay.
Yeah, and geographically, we're talking about the barrier islands and the coastal estuaries sitting directly between the modern Carolinas and Spanish Florida.
And the timeline here is just staggering when you compare it to the standard British narrative we all learn.
Oh, it really throws people off.
I mean, the text notes that the very first Catholic Mass within the boundaries of the modern United States actually took place in this territory.
Yeah, at a settlement called San Miguel de Gualdape.
Right. And that was all the way back in 1526.
Way before Jamestown.
Decades before Jamestown. And then by the 1540s, you have Hernando de Soto's expedition marching straight through the interior, clashing with these massive, complex Mississippian native chiefdoms.
Right. They weren't just passing through on the coast.
The European footprint here spoke Spanish for a very, very long time.
They were deeply embedded. And, the Spanish mission system wasn't just about religious conversion either.
What else was it doing?
It was an intelligence network. It was a diplomatic buffer explicitly designed to protect their primary colonial holdings further south, like in Florida and the Caribbean.
Oh, so it's a shield.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The friars in Guayamacama, they were basically the northernmost censors on the Spanish imperial alarm system.
The timeline here always trips me up, though, because if the Spanish have this century-long head start with missions and military outposts, I mean, how does the map suddenly flip to British?
It's a violent flick.
Right, they didn't just pack up and abandon prime coastal real estate because they got bored.
No, not at all. They were methodically and violently dismantled.
By the British.
Yeah, the geopolitical tectonic plates shift dramatically in 1670. That's the year the English officially drop an anchor in South Carolina, establishing Charlestown just to the north of these Spanish missionary provinces.
Literally right next door.
Exactly. And from that precise moment, the Georgia coast transforms into this brutal proxy war zone.
So they just start attacking the missions.
Well, the English don't just expand, they apply immense downward pressure. They arm local Native American allies, and they launch this relentless, decades-long series of military and economic raids against the Spanish mission system.
Wow.
And it works. By 1704, that entire Spanish system is completely shattered.
And it's the native populations who are taking the heaviest fire in this imperial crossfire, right?
Absolutely. They're caught right in the middle.
The text highlights a massive turning point here, the Yamasee War, which runs from 1715 to 1717.
Glacial conflict.
I've read about this conflict in other contexts, but framing it as the clearing mechanism for the Georgia colony it's fascinating. Because the Yamasee people were originally heavily allied with the British, right?
Very much so.
They were involved in the deerskin trade, and they even helped the British attack the Spanish. So how does it turn into a war against the British?
Well, that alliance was highly lucrative for South Carolina, but it was built on incredibly extractive, unfair terms.
Like what?
The British traders systematically abused the relationship. They basically trapped the Yamasee in these predatory debt cycles for manufactured goods.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and when the debts couldn't be paid, the traders began outright enslaving Yamasee women and children to sell them into the Caribbean sugar plantations.
That is horrific.
It's completely brutal. So the Yamasee retaliated. They launched a massive, highly coordinated pan-native uprising that very nearly wiped South Carolina entirely off the map.
But South Carolina survives it.
They do. They leverage other native alliances, and they retaliate with devastating force. The Yamasee are decimated, and the survivors are pushed all the way down south into Spanish Florida.
So when we look at the arrival of the British in Georgia a few decades later, it completely shatters that whole empty frontier myth we talked about.
Completely.
They didn't find a blank slate. They actively engineered a vacancy. It's a scorched earth geopolitical real estate grab.
Engineered vacancy captures the mechanics of it perfectly, actually.
Right.
They systematically depopulated the coast.
Right.
But geopolitical actions have immediate physical reactions. By violently clearing out the Spanish and the Yamasee, the British inadvertently created this massive, highly vulnerable geographic void.
A void that someone else could fill.
Exactly. You suddenly have this dangerous, empty hallway situated directly between the incredibly wealthy slave-based plantations of South Carolina to the north.
And the heavily fortified Spanish military outpost down in San Agustin, Florida to the south.
Right. It is a terrifying position for South Carolina to be in.
Because they're sitting there generating immense wealth through their plantation economy, but they're looking nervously over their shoulder at this empty buffer zone.
They know that at any moment, a Spanish military expedition could march right up the coast, through that void, and burn Charlestown to the ground.
They need a shield.
The strategic vulnerability was undeniable. The British Crown absolutely needed a physical barrier to absorb any northern advance by the Spanish.
Okay.
And that specific atmosphere of geopolitical panic over in London, that is the catalyst for James Oglethorpe. That panic opens the door for one of the most anomalous settlement plans in the history of European colonization.
So enter James Oglethorpe in 1732.
Right.
He's a member of the British Parliament, and he steps up to compose a brand new colony to plug this dangerous gap.
Yep, the buffer zone.
And right off the bat, the encyclopedia explicitly debunks a massive historical myth about his proposal.
Oh, the penal colony, yes.
Yes. The prevailing cultural memory is that Georgia was founded as a penal colony, like a dumping ground for Britain's hardened criminals.
Right.
But the sources are unequivocal here. That is categorically false.
It's a myth that just refuses to die. I think it's likely because it conflates Georgia with later penal colonies, like Australia.
That makes sense. So what was his actual goal?
Oglethorpe's actual vision was driven by the specific philanthropic movements of early 18th century England. He was deeply, deeply embedded in parliamentary prison reform.
Oh, so he was working with prisons, just not sending the convicts away?
Exactly. He was inspecting London's debtors' prisons, places like the Fleet and the Marshalsea, and he was just appalled by what he saw.
What was happening then?
He saw thousands of people locked in squalid cells, literally dying of typhus, simply because they had fallen into minor financial arrears.
Just for debt.
Just for debt. He viewed them not as criminals, but as victims of an unregulated, rapidly urbanizing economy.
That's why he coined the term the worthy poor.
Exactly. He wanted to create a second-chance refuge for them.
And to prove the point, the text mentions that when the very first ship, the Anne, makes landfall in 1733 to establish Savannah.
The passenger manifest contains absolutely 0 prisoners.
0. It is populated entirely by free citizens, tradesmen, and impoverished families who are just looking for a clean slate.
Right. So Oglethorpe, along with a syndicate of English philanthropists, they secure a royal charter from King George II.
The trustees.
Yeah, they establish themselves as the trustees for the establishing of the colony of Georgia. And they operate under this fascinating Latin motto, non sibi sed alicis.
Which translates to not for ourselves, but for others.
Exactly. And to ensure that, the trustees were legally barred from holding office or owning land in the colony themselves.
Wow, really? So no conflicts of interest?
None. The design was purely for social engineering, not corporate profit. They implemented what we now call the Oglethorpe Plan.
And the mechanics of the Oglethorpe Plan are where this history goes from being a standard colonial venture to this radical utopian experiment.
It's wild.
The trustees essentially tried to mandate a system of absolute agrarian equality. They looked at the extreme wealth stratification back in England and the massive wealthy estates right next door in South Carolina.
Right, the billionaires next door.
And they just decided to legally engineer those inequalities out of existence.
And the mechanism they used to enforce this equality was a rigid, totally uncompromising system of land regulation.
The 50-acre rule.
Under the Oglethorpe Plan, land ownership was strictly capped at 50 acres per family. No exceptions. It was a package deal, too.
How is it split up?
You received a small town lot for a house, a 5-acre garden plot on the edge of town, and a 45-acre farm further out.
Right.
And that was the absolute limit.
50 acres, period. Like, if your neighbor's crops failed and they went bankrupt, you couldn't swoop in and buy their land at a discount to double your acreage.
Yep.
And if you had a highly profitable harvest, you couldn't invest that capital into expanding your estate. The regulations specifically forbade anyone from acquiring additional land through purchase.
They even manipulated the inheritance laws to prevent wealth consolidation across generations. They were serious about this.
But the text does detail one specific loophole regarding indentured labor, right?
Yeah, there was the headright system. It provided a very controlled exception.
How did that work?
If a colonist arrived with enough of their own capital to pay for the transatlantic transportation of an indentured servant, that colonist could receive an additional 50-acre increment for bringing that laborer over.
Okay, so you could get a little more.
A little more, but the total accumulation was still heavily capped. And crucially, once the indentured servant completed their term of service, which was usually just a few years to pay off the voyage,
Right.
they were then entitled to receive their own 50-acre parcel.
The structural intent there is brilliant in a very highly controlling sort of way.
Oh, absolutely.
The entire system is meticulously calibrated to create and endlessly perpetuate an economy based strictly on self-sufficient, small-scale family farming.
And a middle-class utopia.
You are legislating a middle class into existence and making it legally impossible for a ruling class to emerge.
That's exactly it.
But building an egalitarian society required one more rule. And it is arguably the most shocking regulation for a colony situated in the Deep South.
The slavery ban.
Yeah. From 1735 until 1750, the trustees of Georgia officially and actively prohibited African slavery as a matter of public policy.
It was a monumental legislative anomaly. I mean, think about it. Every single other British colony in the Americas at that time either actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade or implicitly allowed the institution to exist within its borders.
But Georgia stood completely alone with an outright parliamentary ban.
Completely alone.
But the sources make a very sharp pivot here, and I think it's an important one. As much as a modern reader might want to look back and applaud Oglethorpe as this 21st century human rights visionary operating in the 1700s.
Right, the modern lens.
Yeah, the underlying motivation for this ban wasn't primarily moral at all.
No, it wasn't. What's fascinating here is that the ban on slavery was At its absolute foundation, a ruthless military and economic calculation.
How so?
You have to trace the logic back to the primary purpose of the colony. It is a buffer zone. It is a military shield against the Spanish in Florida.
Right.
The trustees analyzed the slave-based plantation economy of South Carolina, and they identified it as a massive, glaring security vulnerability.
Because if you have a border colony populated by thousands of brutally oppressed enslaved people,
Yeah.
and the Spanish military is sitting just a few days' march across the Florida border, actively broadcasting promises of freedom and sanctuary to any enslaved person who escapes or rebels.
You have structurally engineered an internal insurrection. You've built a powder keg right on your front line.
Precisely. A large enslaved population was viewed as a built-in fifth column.
Right. Furthermore, if the trustees permitted slavery, the economic logic of the era dictates that wealthy planters will inevitably buy up all the land, consolidate it into massive plantations, and leave the territory defended by a tiny, dispersed minority of wealthy white elites.
And Oglethorpe didn't need a handful of aristocrats sipping tea on vast estates.
No, he needed density. He needed a highly motivated, heavily armed population of tough, working-class white soldiers who had a personal 50-acre stake in holding the line against the Spanish invasion.
So the ban on slavery was just the mechanism to ensure the population remained composed of yeoman farmers who doubled as a local militia.
Exactly. It strips the romance away from the founding, sure, but the social engineering is entirely pragmatic. The blueprint was designed for defense, not just virtue.
So the philanthropy was fundamentally serving the military strategy. The worthy poor were just being imported to be the frontline infantry against the Spanish Empire.
Basically, yes.
But engineering a society on a drafting table in London is one thing. Actually surviving in it is another.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is where we see the utopian experiment violently fracture under the weight of the environment. The collision with reality was incredibly swift. Let's talk about the physical climate these English settlers walked into.
The environment was actively hostile to the agrarian yeoman lifestyle Oglethorpe had mandated. I mean, the historical records constantly refer to the summer months in the Low Country as the sixth season.
The sixth season?
Yes. The coastal geography, the tidal marshes, the heavy humidity, the stagnant water. It was an absolute breeding ground for tropical diseases.
Mosquitoes, right?
Primarily, yes. They were dealing with mosquito-borne pathogens like malaria and yellow fever. And while they didn't understand the mosquito vector at the time, they understood that the environment itself was lethal.
People were dropping like flies.
The mortality rates for the white indentured servants and the small-time farmers working their 50-acre plots in the summer heat were astronomically high.
You know, reading this, you're basically describing a high-security bunker.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Like, Oglethorpe recruits people to live inside, puts them on strict rations, makes them all sleep in the same size cots, and assigns them guard duty. It's miserable, it's sweltering, and people are dying of malaria.
But it keeps the Spanish out.
Right. But the problem is, while they are sweating out fevers on their 50-acre plots, they're looking right across the Savannah River into South Carolina. And they see South Carolina planters becoming fabulously wealthy.
Right next door.
They see massive estates booming on the back of enslaved labor.
And it creates an unbearable psychological and economic pressure cooker. You have colonists in Georgia essentially trapped in a subsistence lifestyle by law, enduring horrific mortality rates, and watching people of their own nationality just miles away accumulate vast dynastic fortunes.
It's unsustainable.
The internal political pressure to abandon the trustees' rules was immense. And on top of that, you have a macroeconomic shift happening back in Europe.
Right, because the economic conditions in England actually start improving during this period. Which means the pipeline of the worthy poor dries up. If you are a struggling tradesman in London and the local economy is stabilizing, you are significantly less likely to sign a binding contract of indentured servitude to go risk dying of yellow fever in a Georgia swamp.
You just stay in London.
Yeah. So the labor supply required to maintain Oglethorpe's yeoman vision is evaporating exactly as the colonists are demanding the right to get rich.
And right at the apex of this internal crisis, the external threat finally materializes. The geopolitical pressure cooker explodes into a conflict known as the War of Jenkins' Ear.
Okay.
In 1742, Spanish forces launch a major, coordinated amphibious assault on the Georgia coast.
This is the ultimate stress test for Oglethorpe's human wall. Does the 50-acre militia actually work?
It works flawlessly.
Really?
Yeah, Oglethorpe mobilizes his local forces, these exact same yeoman farmers he's been forcing to drill, and they meet this Spanish advance at the Battle of Bloody Marsh on St. Simon's Island.
And they win.
The British colonial forces achieve a decisive tactical victory. They completely shatter the Spanish offensive. And a few years later, the 1748 Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle officially ends the broader war.
Which confirms the English position.
Explicitly confirms it and effectively neutralizes the threat of further Spanish attacks from Florida.
But this brings us back to the bunker analogy. The colonists survive the siege. The war ends, the threat evaporates,
Right.
and these colonists look out the bunker window and see their South Carolina neighbors throwing this lavish, albeit structurally brutal, mansion party. They're obviously going to demand to be let out to join the party.
Of course they are.
So, by achieving this incredible military success at Bloody Marsh, did Oglethorpe ironically doom his own social experiment?
That is the great tragic paradox of early Georgia history. By succeeding so completely in his military objective, by physically securing the border and breaking the Spanish threat, Oglethorpe rendered the entire justification for his social blueprint obsolete. The British Parliament and the colonial administration no longer required a hardcore, densely packed buffer of yeoman farmers. The existential dread was gone.
And without the dread?
The moment the military necessity vanished, the door was wide open for sheer economic greed to dismantle the utopia.
And greed didn't just dismantle it, it completely bulldozed it overnight. We are entering the pivot now, and the speed of this transition is staggering.
It's incredibly fast.
In 1749, bowing to relentless pressure from the colonists, the trustees officially overturned the ban on African slavery. Just 3 years later, in 1752, the trustees completely throw in the towel.
They give up?
They surrender the charter, hand the entire colony back over to the British Crown, and Georgia becomes a standard royal colony. The egalitarian experiment is dead and buried.
And the demographic and economic explosion that follows the lifting of those regulations is horrifying in its scale.
What happens?
We are watching an entirely new economic engine being dropped into the colony. Between 1750 and 1775, the planters frantically import enslaved people to build out the new infrastructure.
How many are we talking?
The enslaved population rockets from fewer than 500 individuals to approximately 18,000.
Good Lord.
Within the span of a single generation, enslaved Africans become the absolute demographic majority of the colony's entire population.
But that speed, that requires a massive influx of capital and expertise. It wasn't a gradual organic shift, it was a hostile takeover. Where did all of this wealth and infrastructure come from so quickly?
It flooded in directly from next door.
South Carolina.
Exactly. The moment the 50-acre land limits and the slavery ban were abolished, the wealthier, established planters from South Carolina migrated southward into Georgia. They possessed vastly more capital than the original Georgia settlers, and they instantly dominated the colony both economically and politically.
So they basically just, copy-pasted the entire South Carolina economy.
They didn't invent a new system. They simply copy-pasted the institutions, the laws, and the brutally extractive labor systems of the South Carolina Lowcountry into this newly opened territory.
And the sources are very specific about the mechanics of this labor system. They point out that after 1766, these planters stopped relying on transshipping people from the Caribbean or other colonies.
Right.
They started importing enslaved people directly from highly specific regions in West Africa, places like Sierra Leone, the Gambia, and Angola.
And the logic behind targeting those specific geographies is crucial to understanding the economy they were building. The South Carolina planters who annexed Georgia wanted to construct a rice coast.
They wanted to grow tidal rice.
Yes. And cultivating rice in coastal, brackish tidal zones is an incredibly complex, highly engineered agricultural process.
It's not just throwing seeds in the ground.
Not at all. It requires massive earthworks, dikes, levees, intricate sluice gates, and a profound specialized understanding of tidal hydrology to flood and drain the fields at the exact right moments to kill weeds but nourish the rice.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the encyclopedia highlights a massive historical debate regarding this exact engineering.
Oh, this is a huge shift in how we understand the history.
Yeah. The traditional, older historical narrative essentially views the wealthy British planters as the architects of this wealth. Like, the assumption was that the masters designed these elaborate hydraulic systems, understood the engineering, and simply utilized enslaved Africans as brute, interchangeable physical labor to dig the mud.
Right. That was the old assumption.
Yet the text notes a major shift. Many historians now argue that the English possessed absolutely no background in risciculture.
None. It completely reframes the power dynamic of the early colonies' wealth. If we examine the agricultural history of England, they grew wheat and barley. They knew nothing about tidal rice.
But the Africans did.
Exactly. The specific regions of West Africa being targeted, Sierra Leone, the Gambia, have possessed highly sophisticated, centuries-old knowledge of exactly this type of tidal rice cultivation.
Wow.
The historical argument is that the entire foundation of the Low Countries' immense agricultural wealth was built directly upon the pre-existing technological and engineering genius of the enslaved Africans. The planters were importing stolen intellectual property alongside physical labor.
The enslaved populations were the actual engineers of the system that oppressed them. That's incredible to think about.
It really is.
And this concentration of specific West African populations forced into the isolated coastal environment of the Low Country and the Sea Islands, it catalyzed something entirely unique, didn't it?
Yes, the culture.
It led to the creation of the Gullah, or as it was more commonly designated in Georgia, the Geechee culture.
The demographic concentration was key to that. Because these massive hydraulic rice plantations required hundreds of enslaved workers to operate, and because the planters were intentionally purchasing individuals from closely related geographic and linguistic areas in West Africa.
They could actually talk to each other.
Right. The enslaved population was able to communicate and forge a unique creolized culture. The Gullah Geechee culture managed to preserve profound, intact elements of West African linguistic structure, religious practices, and agricultural heritage, synthesizing them with European and Native American influences.
And the isolation that allowed this culture to survive was directly linked to the environmental hostility we talked about earlier, right? The sick season.
Exactly. The white planters were still terrified of the sick season. The text explicitly states that Georgia's coastal society began to mirror the brutal absentee owner models of the Caribbean sugar colonies, like Barbados and Jamaica, far more than it resembled the society of places like Virginia or Maryland.
So the planters didn't even live there most of the time.
The disease vector dictated the social structure. The planters experienced incredibly high rates of absenteeism. During the summer, when the malaria and yellow fever outbreaks peaked, the wealthy planters would entirely abandon their coastal estates.
They just leave.
They would flee to the interior pine barrens, to the northern cities, or even back to England. They left these massive, sprawling industrial agricultural complexes entirely worked, maintained, and essentially managed by enslaved Africans under the surveillance of a small number of hired overseers. It was an environment of intense physical isolation and extreme systemic brutality. It is the absolute antithesis of the small, 50-acre, self-sufficient family farms Oglethorpe had mandated just a few decades prior.
It is a complete 180-degree inversion of the founding blueprint. The motto, not for ourselves but for others, is quite literally buried under the mud of the rice paddies.
Literally buried.
But to understand the ultimate conclusion of this transition, we have to look beyond the coast. Because the plantation economy doesn't stop at the tidal zones.
No, it expands relentlessly. And to see how deeply this system entrenched itself, we can look at a report filed in 1766 by the royal governor, James Wright.
Okay, what does he say?
He's writing back to his superiors in England, and he admits quite bluntly that Georgia possesses absolutely no manufacturing capacity of its own.
None.
None. He notes they produce a trifling quantity of coarse homespun cloth and some basic blacksmithing, but literally everything else, every yard of silk, every linen shirt, all wool, shoes, stockings, nails, locks, iron tools, it is entirely imported from Great Britain.
They had intentionally constructed a society that functions solely to extract raw agricultural commodities and consume finished goods.
A completely hollow economy.
Entirely dependent on external supply lines for its basic physical survival. But as immensely profitable as those coastal rice plantations were, they were geographically trapped, right? You can only grow tidal rice where the ocean tides push the river water. The real accelerant, the technological spark that supercharges this plantation economy and drives it deep into the interior of the continent arrives in 1794.
The invention of the cotton gin.
Yes. Eli Whitney, a mechanical artisan from Massachusetts, is residing on a plantation outside Savannah when he patents this device. And the mechanics of the gin completely alter the trajectory of the American economy.
It changes everything.
Because before the gin, the only cotton that was highly profitable was long staple, or Sea Island cotton, which only grew on the coast.
Right.
The inland regions could only grow short staple cotton. And short staple cotton was economically useless because the seed is incredibly sticky. It adheres tightly to the fiber. It took a single worker an entire day to manually clean just 1 pound of short staple cotton.
Just wasn't worth the effort.
But the gin mechanizes that separation. It uses a system of fine wire teeth on a revolving cylinder to pull the cotton fibers through a grate that is simply too narrow for the seeds to pass through.
Simple but revolutionary.
Exactly. Suddenly, a single machine can clean 50 pounds of cotton a day. The bottleneck is shattered. And simultaneously, the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain is spinning up, and the textile mills in Manchester are screaming for an infinite supply of raw cotton. King Cotton is officially crowned.
And this mechanical breakthrough allows the brutal logic of the plantation economy to finally break free from the coastal swamps.
It moves inland.
It spreads like a wildfire inland, moving rapidly up into the Piedmont region. This expansion creates what became known as the Black Belt of central Georgia.
Why is it called that?
The term initially referred to the dark, incredibly fertile soil of the region, but it eventually came to reflect the grim demographics of the labor system. The demand for forced labor to clear the virgin pine forests and harvest the endless fields of cotton was insatiable.
Just astronomical demand.
By 1860, the enslaved population trapped in this inland Black Belt was 3 times greater than the enslaved population remaining on the older coastal rice plantations.
But the expansion of that cotton empire requires massive amounts of acreage, and that inland territory wasn't just empty land waiting to be farmed.
Definitely not.
When Oglethorpe was setting up his little utopian buffer on the coast, the vast, overwhelming majority of the modern state of Georgia was firmly under the sovereign control of powerful Native American nations, primarily the Creek and the Cherokee.
Right.
To make room for this continent-spanning agricultural machine, the original inhabitants had to be systematically removed.
Which brings us to a deeply tragic, state-sponsored chapter of this transition. The state of Georgia, with the eventual full backing of the federal government, utilized relentless legal, economic, and military pressure to force the Native Americans off their ancestral lands, all just to feed the global hunger for cotton.
Where does it start?
We see the first massive blow following the Creek War, which ends in 1814. General Andrew Jackson forces the Creek Confederacy to sign a treaty surrendering more than 21 million acres of land across southern Georgia and central Alabama.
21 million acres.
It's massive. But 21 million acres wasn't enough to satisfy the demand. The pressure just keeps mounting, shifting northward toward the Cherokee Nation.
And what triggers that?
The catalyst there is the discovery of gold in the North Georgia mountains in 1829. It was actually the first major gold rush in United States history.
Oh, wow, before California.
Way before. Thousands of white prospectors and settlers flood violently into Cherokee territory, completely ignoring all treaties. And the tragic irony here is that the Cherokee Nation had done everything the United States had asked of them to prove their quote-unquote civilization.
Right. They adapted.
They had a written constitution, a bicameral legislature, they had agricultural systems. They even took their fight to the United States Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia, and they won.
They won the Supreme Court case.
They did. The court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was sovereign, and Georgia's laws had no force there.
But legal victories mean nothing without enforcement. The state of Georgia, fully supported by President Andrew Jackson, simply ignored the Supreme Court's ruling.
Just ignored it entirely.
They stripped the Cherokee of their legal rights and distributed their land to white settlers via lotteries. It culminated in the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and ultimately the forced, militarized deportation of the Cherokee in 1838.
The Trail of Tears.
Federal troops rounded up thousands of Cherokee citizens, held them in stockades, and marched them westward to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. This forced relocation resulted in the deaths of over 4,000 Cherokee people from exposure, disease, and starvation.
The engineered vacancy that the British had utilized on the coast in the 1700s was now being violently replicated across the entire interior of the state in the 1800s.
So, what does this all mean for you as the listener when we look back at the original blueprint? The arc of this history is almost dizzying.
It really is a roller coaster.
We started with a colony that was explicitly founded by philanthropists, a society operating under the legal mandate of not for ourselves, but for others. It was a territory actively engineered to permanently ban slavery, to legally prohibit land monopolies, and to enforce a rigid agrarian equality among self-sufficient yeoman farmers.
And within the span of barely a century, that exact same political entity evolved into an aggressive agricultural leviathan. It became an economy utterly dependent on the forced, brutalized labor of nearly 500,000 enslaved people. It fueled its geographic expansion by violently and systematically expelling its native inhabitants.
Complete transformation.
It morphed into a highly stratified society, dominated completely by a tiny fraction of hyper-wealthy elite planters who monopolized the politics, the economy, and the land.
It is the absolute total victory of the extractive plantation economy over the utopian blueprint.
And if we pull back to view the broader panorama of American history, this specific economic foundation, a top-heavy, completely agrarian society reliant entirely on a single cash crop and built structurally on enslaved labor, it set Georgia on an unavoidable, catastrophic collision course with the industrializing North.
The Civil War.
Exactly. By completely abandoning Oglethorpe's vision of self-sufficiency and diverse, small-scale farming, Georgia destined itself for the devastation of the Civil War. The hollow economy Governor Wright warned about in 1766 meant they had no industrial base to fight a modern war, ultimately leading to the complete destruction of its infrastructure during Sherman's march to the sea.
The society they engineered was immensely, staggeringly profitable in the short term, but structurally it was incredibly fragile.
Very fragile.
It's a breathtaking transformation to process. In just a few decades, we watched this territory morph from a quiet network of Spanish Catholic missions to a violently depopulated buffer zone to a radical British egalitarian experiment before finally capitulating entirely to the dark, immensely profitable machinery of the Southern plantation economy.
And it leaves us with a profound historical what-if to ponder as we close.
Okay, lay it on me.
Consider the alternative trajectory. What if the trustees in London had managed to hold their ground against the economic pressure?
Oh, man.
What if they had found a way to strictly enforce the 50-acre land limit and permanently maintain the ban on slavery, perhaps by subsidizing the colony longer? How would the entire trajectory of the American South and the inevitability of the American Civil War have been altered?
Imagine a massive, non-slave-holding, fiercely egalitarian, middle-class Georgia sitting right in the geographic heart of the Deep South.
It changes everything.
Would that presence have broken the political power of the solid South before it ever had a chance to form? It really forces you to reconsider the blueprints we are drawing up for our own society today.
It absolutely does.
Because this history is a powerful reminder for you that the economic landscapes we take for granted as permanent or inevitable were not preordained. They were actively debated, they were shaped by policy, and in the case of Georgia's founding Utopia, they were deliberately and utterly abandoned in the pursuit of wealth.